live with Just Leadership Facebook discussion series. I am DeAnna Hoskins, President and CEO of Just Leadership. We amplify the power of directly impacted people by investing, educating, and empowering and elevating their voices so that they have the tools and resources necessary to self organize, advocate for themselves, their families, and their communities. Together, we will build an equitable, fair, just US. Each year, almost 60,000 pregnant women enter the prison system. The Supreme Court's recent decision to overturn Roe versus Wade signals more surveillance, more targeting, and criminalization of marginalized communities. For incarcerated people, it will strip away even more autonomy over their own bodies in facilities where access to healthcare is already inadequate. Today, I am joined by JLUSA's leaders, Kimba Smith, author, consultant, national public speaker, and founder of the Kimba Smith Foundation, Lauren Johnson, policy advocate strategist at the ACLU of Texas, and Michigan State Senator Erica Geist. Thank you. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining me.
Thank
So,
you.
can you hear us?
Yes.
So I kind of want to jump in. Today is Women Equality Day. Some issues are going on. And typically when you talk about women equality, people go straight to salaries, compensation, and different things. And sometimes we fail to forget about healthcare issues. So Kimba and Lauren, incarcerated people already face limited access to healthcare, especially women, and basic rights behind bars. In some states, rates of miscarriage for incarcerated women range from 19 to 22%, exceeding estimates of the national rate. Can you speak about how the reversal of Roe versus Wade may continue to strip away the rights of women behind bars and impact their healthcare outcomes?
When you, I'll go first. When you speak about, and thank you for having me. When you speak about miscarriage rates and incarceration, ultimately, briefly for those that don't know, I was 7 months pregnant when I turned myself in to the authorities. And not only was I 7 months pregnant, but eventually the drug dealer that I was in a relationship with, I ended up having drug conspiracy charges as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. He eventually was murdered. And so I don't think people understand, even before going into the system, the trauma that women have endured. And also, that relationship was an abusive relationship as well. So, going in, and then, having the authorities telling me, I could face a life sentence. And ultimately I was sentenced to 24 and a half years, and going through, just a really traumatic period in my life. I definitely could understand how, one could miscarry because of the stress, and not only the stress, but also the standard of care that you get while you're incarcerated. So I feel like it would significantly impact women who are incarcerated, because they should be able to control their own bodies and make a decision, for what's best for them. And, I had my parents who, they could have told me, no, I'm not going to care, for your child. But, getting an abortion, that was never a thought for me. And I'm grateful that I had my parents, but obviously not everyone has that. And you have to make the best decisions that you can, for your child. And my goodness, to get sentenced to 24 and a half years. And, back in 94, there were women getting sentenced to life sentence. And so to mentally, I don't think people realize what a woman will go through being pregnant against all odds, and to have to be forced to give birth to a child, and then not know where that child's going to end up if you don't have anyone that can care for that child. It just seems insurmountable, where, eventually your child will end up being a a product of the state where, they'll be in anybody's home. So I feel like it is a huge injustice, and really who's thinking about the child? Because obviously people think that, some people don't see incarcerated people as human. I mean, we need to start, there. And I think, even if you don't want to think about us, what about the benefit and negative impact, to that child?
Thank you. Lauren?
So for me, Kimba and I have some parallels, but when I was pregnant with my first child, I had just found out that I was pregnant and had not, I was living in a lifestyle where I was using substances. Um, I remember having talks with my son's father, and I would just start weeping because I didn't necessarily want to have an abortion, but I couldn't imagine bringing a baby into the lifestyle that we were living, and I couldn't imagine a lifestyle that was different. Like it's so important to be able to have a dream before you can fulfill the dream, and I couldn't even dream big enough to imagine us not being stuck in the lifestyle that we were in. And still had a choice to make. And then 2 days later, before I could really come to terms with the situation that we were in, was arrested. And in that moment, this was, my son just turned 18. He's graduated high school. He's doing really well. But in that moment, this was not as precarious of a right in that time period, but it still wasn't really an option for women who were incarcerated in the county jail. If you could, you could ask for an abortion, and they could schedule one for you, but you would not only have to pay for the procedure, but you would also have to pay for the security to take you to the procedure. And if you could afford all of those things, then you could probably just bond out of jail and deal with your case from the outside. And so if you're poor, which a majority of women who are incarcerated had less than $10,000 income the year before they're incarcerated, you can't afford to bail out of jail. So my choice was either find somebody to take this baby because they were going to sentence me to a long prison term, or, essentially there was no choice. I was having a baby. It's just what's going to happen to the baby next. And I will tell you this, that I didn't have a strong support system. I had one person that was willing and able to step in and care for my son and take him for me. If that person had not been there, and so many women who are in this kind of situation don't have that one person. Either they've got other children, their families are busy supporting the other children. It's just not, people are not in a position to deal with that. And so what happens? The woman is traumatized. What I can tell you is that if my aunt had not been able to take my son, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. It was already hard enough to give birth in jail, and then to have my son taken from me 2 days later. I couldn't stop crying for the next couple of days. That was the single worst day of my life. And I knew that I was going to get that child back eventually. And I just can't imagine the trajectory that my life would have taken had I not had that person to be able to step in and take him. Now, on the flip side, in Texas, where I'm living, we worked a few sessions ago to pass one of the more comprehensive dignity bills. And generally speaking, when you talk about dignity bills, there are two provisions that usually exist. One of them is not shackling women during birth. And the other is making sure that women have adequate feminine hygiene products. Those, the dignity bills have to be fought for. And when you think about the fact that there has to be a massive campaign nationwide fighting for women to not be shackled when they're giving birth, and fighting for women to have access to feminine hygiene products, that's just so wild that those are things that we're still having to fight for. And we worked hard, and we passed a really comprehensive dignity bill in Texas that also allowed for women to get a whole 72 hours with their baby, which they were not getting before. And it fought for the feminine hygiene access, and it fought for several other provisions. But the reality at the end of the day is, just because you pass a law doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And, when I talk to people who are still in the system, nothing has really changed for them, right? Like, we worked really hard to pass a really comprehensive bill, and they're still having the same access issues that they were having before. And so, the fact that we're still having to fight for the bare minimum as far as like women who are incarcerated goes, the undoing of Roe and the Dobbs decision is making it, any rights that women on the outside in the free world have are already so much more amplified. Like, women who are incarcerated only have a sliver of whatever women out here get. And if women out here are about to be criminalized, and which we're going to see, then it's going to be 1,000 times worse for the women that we're trying to work for who are incarcerated.
Wow. Thank you both. You both brought up something very important about having to fight, or having support systems to actually take that child and care for that child until you come back home, return home. But Senator Lauren brought up something really important about fighting for legislation. Why are we fighting for women to have basic feminine hygiene products, right? Why are we fighting for women not to be shackled in an animalistic way, to be treated with human dignity? Can you speak about your work around reproductive rights and healthcare for women in Michigan, or people in Michigan? And what are the biggest barriers against passing legislation that protects these rights? And what do you anticipate will be the most pressing issue for people, including healthcare providers, and anyone else seeking abortions now?
Thank you so much, DeAnna. And Kimba and Lauren, your stories are so powerful. There is, in Michigan, we have a legislature that is hostile to the concept of treating people who are incarcerated with any semblance of human dignity. I think that we have society on the whole has this overly punitive view of people who have made a mistake or series of mistakes, or been in a situation that has now has them on the wrong side of our compiled laws, and then incarcerated. And that the punishment for that is whatever that punishment is, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony conviction, should not be being dehumanized. And in Michigan, with the work of some incredible people, a broad coalition from Sawatu's Freedom Team to the American Friends Service Committee to Safe and Just, we worked on what originally started off as legislation to improve the standards of care for pregnant incarcerated people. We only have one women's state-run facility here in the state of Michigan. And we were able, at one point we had an ally in the legislature, in the Republican majority, but that person left. And so when we had to continue that work, we weren't able to get it all the way through, but we worked with the executive branch to get policy changes in the Department of Corrections. So women, people who are pregnant, are no longer shackled. They are to be able to create a birth plan, work with a doula, have that autonomy and that say in what's going to happen to the child they're going to deliver, have that skin-to-skin contact after delivery, whether it's vaginal or cesarean. There are some things we weren't able to get in, but we got about 90% of what we were aiming for. So, because whether it's 1 or 1,000 members of the population who are pregnant, and whether they came in pregnant or whether they were impregnated either by choice or, unfortunately, as it happens, by assault because of that imbalanced power dynamic, those who are incarcerated versus the non-incarcerated population that has access to the prison, that they are able to have that access to adequate care because their child did not do anything wrong.
Right. Thank you for that. You said something I think a lot of times, again, society doesn't think about when we talk about Roe versus Wade, that some women enter incarceration, whether it's jail or prison, pregnant, but assaults do happen. That is the reality of the world we live in because of the power dynamics and how this plays a role into those decisions as well. Kind of brings me to my next question of any of you answering. How might the criminalization of abortion impact our communities and contribute to mass incarceration?
Ooh, I will start with that answer. It will expand the prison industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some data that even since Roe became the law of the land back in 73, through the recent fall of Roe, thanks to 6 regressive members of the Supreme Court, that there have been, the National Association of Pregnant Women had documented more than 1,700 cases of pregnant people being arrested, detained, prosecuted, forced to undergo medical interventions because of their status as pregnant people between 1973 and 2020. This is only going to expand, especially in states where abortion is not protected, in spaces where people who are in low-wage jobs and can't cross state lines to receive an abortion. Places like what Texas just enshrined into law yesterday, criminalizing the healthcare professionals. I mean, that's worse than the bounty that was created by SB8, but criminalizing the healthcare professionals who are there to aid in reproductive healthcare, and making criminals out of them. So the number of people who are going to potentially end up being part of the system, going through that process of being prosecuted, of being charged, of having to serve a sentence, is going to expand. And for people who, even if they're not convicted, to have that on their record, and we don't know yet if that's going to be an expungible thing for the states that have expungement, it's going to harm their further economic ability because there are going to be jobs that they can't get. There's going to be housing they can't get. The downstream effects of the fall of Roe are remarkably untenable. And it puts disproportionate harm on already Black and brown and low-income communities, because those are the folks who are not going to be able to take time off. They probably don't have paid sick leave to be able to take time off to care for any sort of health issue, much less the time to go travel to another state, find housing, find lodging, the time to heal, and even do they have the ability to access those very important abortion funds that are out there for just those situations. But there's a whole section of the country where you can't just go to the next state. You have to travel to 5 or 6 other states to get to a state that is not hostile to abortion. And our neighbors, our international neighbors to the north and south, where it's legal, that's an additional hurdle of trying to get to those places.
Well, one of the things that I think about with this issue in particular is, when I go eons back ago, high school, college, that there were young girls that were having abortions, college students, high school students. And, are we now going to, look at, girls that end up, finding another means and with me being a former Virginia parole board member, I know how quickly, when a life is ended, how someone will be sentenced to a tremendous harsh sentence. And so will we find there being, young girls, young women being sentenced as adults? I mean, we don't know how this thing's going to work. And them being juveniles and doing something like this, what would the sentencing guidelines be? And so I definitely feel like that there's some things that haven't even been considered or looked at, in particular with young girls and women, and what is that going to look like? But also too, I was watching the news either last night or early this morning, but I believe that they were talking about how there are these health apps, where I guess they can track if someone's pregnant, and there are concerns about, if the authorities were able to have record of people's apps, would they pursue, arrest with that? So I just think that there is a tremendous hardship, in our communities of the fact that there will be criminalization impact of women and girls because of this law.
Yeah. Oh, the thing that I would add to that is the thing that's been most on my mind lately is the way that this is going to further criminalize women for things that shouldn't be criminalized in the first place. Substance use, for instance, like if somebody is pregnant and abortion is outlawed, criminalized in your state, or the doctors are being criminalized. If we're giving that much credence to a fetus, then women are going to start becoming incarcerated, not for just the simple act of substance use, but there's going to be an enhanced penalty for the harm that she's causing to the fetus that maybe she did or didn't want. And so we're taking all of the autonomy away from women being able to control their bodies. Everybody knows that, but we're also just right on this very dangerous edge where we're going to see an increase in women who are, serving longer sentences for things that previously wouldn't have even been considered a crime. And also, things that are considered a crime as far as substance use that we're treating as crimes that should be treated through a public health lens. Nobody's going to have that anymore. That's the future that I'm so nervous to see come to fruition that, I can't even watch the last season of Handmaid's Tale living in Texas. I can't. It's no longer a fantastical story anymore. This is like we're on the edge of real life documentary series.
Right. Lauren, you went in what I was getting ready to ask for my next question, which has also become my concern, right? We've really moved and worked within the criminal justice system to incorporate public health focus around mental health and substance abuse, even far as creating diversion programs. But my concern is exactly what yours is because if a woman is pregnant and there's an perceived inherent risk to the fetus that she's going to have, is that now going to make people who actually possibly became impregnated because of that mental health or substance abuse issue of life actually not eligible for diversion programs because now the classification of the crime or the offense has actually been increased in some kind of way, which will result in actually prison term versus access to treatment and services that are actually needed because of the underlying issue. So thank you for that. One of the things that when we talk about this and we think about, I think Senator talked about having to go to other states, having to travel to other states. And when you look at why Roe versus Wade was even created, right? Who was the highest risk individuals who were dying from what was called back alley abortions, the people being criminalized for those activities? We know we have over 4.5 million people on probation and parole in some type of community supervision, but a large section of that are women. What are your thoughts of how people who are on probation and parole who can't leave state lines by choice to get an abortion without permission? How is this going to impact them? If I'm living in the community, I'm on probation or parole, community supervision, I need to travel across state lines to choose to get an abortion to where it's legal, but I also need permission from that authority to cross those state lines. I'm interested in your thoughts around how that's truly going to impact people who have been sentenced to some level of community supervision.
I think, personally, it's going to, again, still give the government the power over what happens to my body. And, I had a probation officer who was over the top crazy. And so, I can remember when I wanted to purchase a car, he basically was telling me that I shouldn't get this type of car and what type of car I should get. And so, to have to ask a probation officer if you can go across state lines, depending on what type of probation officer you get, and in different cities, some of them are more progressive and they're about evidence-based practices. And there are others in different cities and states that are rogue. I mean, they do whatever they want to do and they can make your life miserable. And so they could have no empathy at all. And they would be the ones that would make the decision on whether or not you could travel outside of state. Because I remember several times having to ask my probation officer permission to travel out of state, but they hold that power in their hands. So it depends on, what probation and parole agencies do across this country as it relates to that. And I definitely think it's something that should be addressed.
Thank you.
I think to add to that, there's also, and this goes back to this conversation around surveillance, because unlike in the 70s, thanks to medicine, advances in medicine and technology and science, you can have self-managed abortion care. Right, there's the I'm going to mispronounce it, malefisoprone, but there are there are abortion-inducing drugs that early one can take. So there is until the Supreme Court decision, that was an option where one didn't have to travel to across state lines, even in a universe where there isn't abject hostility towards abortion and access to it. But now that there's this additional surveillance set up, or that's imminent, that's looming over how does one acquire that medication? How does one is one acquiring it? Is one even looking for it on on the internet? Is one trying to have a conversation with someone about, is this a potential option? All of those things now become subject to that surveillance that now can have them be in a position of violating that parole or that probation, because they are now engaging in something that is illegal in their state. So even with the potential access for the medication, that is an important part of reproductive health care, they're further denied that access, and additionally being recriminalized.
Senator, you said something very important that I hadn't even thought about, is that the power that probation and parole officers have when they come to your house to search, right? To search your house, search your computer, and would a simple Google relevation search that shows what I've been researching, will that be criminalized as we see it in other cases of what you search on the internet is actually incriminating to you in some kind of way because it's an illegal activity? I never even thought about just encountering or researching or having a conversation can be seen as a violation of probation or parole. And I think it goes back to the power that Kimba talked about, the power of someone telling you what type of car you can purchase. And I don't think a lot of people's society knows certain states. I know Wisconsin is one of them. The conditions of parole state. Before you buy a car, you got to get permission from your parole or probation officer, right? Before you open a bank account, you have to get this permission. And so I think there's a misunderstanding of the power of the criminal justice system to control people's lives, and that how this is going to impact, have an even larger impact down to the things of moving public health issues into a criminal role that may be the founding theme. Which takes me to the next question for Kimba and Lauren. When you think about the trauma that women um, experience anyway from incarceration, what do you anticipate the impact of the reversal of Roe versus Wade, how it will compound the trauma incarcerated women already experience?
Lauren, do you want to go first, or?
I mean, sure. Again, I flash back to the trauma that I experienced. I knew for my entire pregnancy that I was going to have to give birth inside of the jail or at the local county hospital. But, I made a decision because I had heard the horror stories of women who had gone to prison and then given birth. They have to be shackled on a bus. They have to go on this long ride. They go to the Galveston Hospital. It's a prison hospital unit. And then they get there, they give birth. They may get an hour with their baby if staffing levels are good. There's no guarantee of that. And then there is a lot of pressure for whoever's going to come and pick up that child to come pick it up. And the whole scenario just was horrific. So it was a choice between choosing that or choosing to risk the plea deal that was being offered to me. Because if you don't accept it when they want you to accept it, they can snatch it off the table. To have that 2 days in the same room with my baby. So I opted for that. That 2 days was so important to me. I did not set this baby down for the whole 2 days except to go to the bathroom. My t-shirt still smelled like baby. I did not wash that t-shirt for 6 weeks. When I left the hospital, I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. I was like, okay, what's going to happen. I had prepared for 9 months for this. But when it was time to go, I just could not stop crying. I could not stop crying. If I was awake, I was bawling. And when they took me back to the jail, where they would also not give me the narcotic pain medication because you had just had a baby, but the jail doesn't care about any of that. They also put me aside into a medical observation unit for 24 hours. So basically in complete and total isolation, presumably so that they could make sure I was okay. But even the act of isolating me in that moment was the main thing that made me not okay. If I had had an opportunity to be around other people and to process the traumatic experience that I had just been through, I could have coped a little bit better. And I don't think it was postpartum depression. I think it was just a natural reaction to the situation that I had just been in. But again, I count that as one of the worst days of my entire life on this earth. And so what happens when we put a woman through that, where she has no hope of getting that child back, where she has nobody to come in and take her? Once you've had to carry a child for 9 months and give birth, there's natural bonds and attachments that happen. And so then we're creating this situation that creates more trauma, and which is also going to create women who have nothing to lose anymore. They've lost the thing that potentially they care about the most. You force them to have it and then give it up away, and then they have nothing to lose anymore. So what is the point of trying to do better if this is the way that you're being treated and this is the things that people are willing to allow to happen to you? What's the point? So then we're creating people that don't give a damn, and are, you know, treating themselves through substance use and through the things that they know how to do to survive and to cope. And so, like, this is going to be generational harm. And if what we cared about was for babies to be okay, then we could accomplish that much better through things like sex education, things like, you know, education, access to contraception. You know, we know that those things work, and we're still willing to do all of the things that we know don't work. So it just is baffling to me.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, so you know, like Lauren, you know, I chose to keep my son, and I had my parents to raise him. But that was probably one of the most traumatic experiences I've had in my life. Number one, you know, a woman should be able to choose whether or not she wants to be, because I turned myself into county jail. So I wasn't in a prison yet, I was in jail. And basically, you know, the discomfort, the lack of medical attention during that time. I mean, my snack, I mean, you're supposed to have snacks throughout the day, but my snack was a cold white bread bologna sandwich. And then also going to the clinic every week when I got to that point. I was in the clinic in front of everyone sitting in the waiting room in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed and shackles, and people staring at me, you know, wondering what kind of crime I committed. And it was just really humiliating. And that dignity was not there. And then to, you know, go to the hospital, give birth, and 5 minutes after I gave birth, the U.S. Marshal stormed into my hospital room and said that my leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed at all times. And, you know, if that person, you know, has someone that can actually, in fact, you know, take the child, you know, having to separate from my son, again, like Lauren said, was one of the most painful things. And if a woman would choose not to go through that, you know, I just think that they should have the right to do that. And I'm grateful that, you know, I came from the hospital after my 2 days and I went to the county jail, and I didn't lose my mind, because my body, night after night before giving birth, felt my son moving around, and there's this intimacy with that every night. And for a woman that maybe doesn't want that, I mean, it's just a huge mental strain, spiritual, just everything. It wipes you out. And so for me to have gone back to county jail, and then there was nothing, you know, I'm in still steel bars, concrete, breast gorging. It's just really inhumane. And so one of the things that I know for me that was one of the most traumatic things was, and I still don't know, I feel like there should be something done on a national, federal level with this, is why are people okay with mothers not having physical contact with their child after 2 days? Okay, fine, don't care about me, but think about the harm that it creates that for that child. And so I remember my parents saying how my son would not stop crying uncontrollably after they brought him home, but it took like my scent. They ended up taking him in my room where my scent was still there, and, you know, giving him a clothing where he was able to calm down. But it definitely would compound the trauma that a woman that would like to choose to have an abortion, and for them to be forced to have to go through that, I just hope that our systems are set up to be able to deal with those issues. I mean, most of the time we focus on the men in incarceration, but our women are going to need help with that.
You brought up something very important about the traumatic experience of what a woman's body even goes through with that child actually breathing and growing inside of them. And it made me really realize that during my active addiction, making a decision when I became pregnant to have an abortion because of the lifestyle I was living, and if that was have been a criminal act, what the measures were that I would have been willing to go through in back alley, taking chances on my life to actually have that procedure done. But it never dawned on me to really think if I didn't have that right to choose that has now been removed. I was living a lifestyle that was in criminality in all aspects, suffering from a substance abuse issue when I made that decision. But that's because that decision and that opportunity was availed to me. What would have been the measures that I would have taken? And so it brings me to this question that I think is really important, because this isn't a Supreme Court decision we can just walk away from and say, okay, the states are going to figure it out. Because what happens with states is every time the administration change, a new governor, a new House, a new Senate, we know this issue is always going to be at the table, right? So I guess, Senator, and to Lauren and Kimba, how do we continue to mobilize and advocate for reproductive rights and the right to adequate health care for incarcerated people? Because I think that's a huge part of it. If this is criminalized, this is around reproductive rights and me having a right to choose if I want to give birth, carry a pregnancy. But also, we know, even if I do choose that and I end up in prison or jail, there's a level of inadequate health care that actually takes place for incarcerated people. So how do we bridge these together and continue to mobilize and fight for this?
I think that and Lauren said this at the onset, that the care that is available for women who are not incarcerated is already difficult for pregnant people. We're still fighting for adequate care for people who are pregnant in the workplace, right? There's literally still a Pregnancy Workplace Fairness Act that has yet to be passed. So you imagine what that means for women who are incarcerated. I think we need to be very clear with folks that the difference between being on the outside and being on the inside is one slip up and a judge who is more interested in having you be punished than having you receive any time of help or care. Like you said, DeAnna, we have treatment courts now in many communities. So if you are potentially going to be able to have the option to go through treatment court for a substance use disorder, but now there's the criminality of how that's affecting, the potential criminality of how that's going to affect a child that you're carrying. Like it changes. It changes everything profoundly. And what does that mean for how that judge sentences? Can that judge even have you go through treatment court? Are they now forced to have you incarcerated? And I think that people need to realize, like, these are our loved ones. These are community members. Like, everybody who's on the inside has someone, and yes, I know there are folks who are in there who have come from some very traumatic, unhealthy situations.
Right.
But maybe they have a best friend who is not part of the trauma that got them incarcerated, or they've got a kid, or they've got an aunt or an uncle who loves them, or a partner, or like there are people, like there are loved ones on the outside, and we need to be listening to them. We need to be making sure that those loved ones have those tools to advocate for their loved ones who are behind bars. We need to make sure that we have those liaisons between the community and the folks who are incarcerated, who can advocate for them and advocate with policymakers, people like me, and that those and that we're changing those laws, and that we're not just looking at new laws, but I mean, here in Michigan, we've got this antiquated 1931 law that criminalizes abortion and birth control, and even having conversations about how to deal with menopause. I'm not kidding. It is that ridiculous. And those are things that we forget end up still existing when some other thing happens federally that then renders those laws moot rather. So we need to make sure that we are really digging deep, and that the community, that voters and non-voters alike, are mobilizing and talking to their representatives and their legislators and if it's a local ordinance, their local boards of electeds, to make sure that we are not harming the health care of anybody, whether they are on the inside or on the outside. Because if folks on the inside aren't healthy, it creates additional harm. It adds to recidivism. It adds to the trauma. It creates the generational trauma. The downstream effects are so far and wide, and we need to be preventing those.
Great. Thank you, Senator.
I would just, my thoughts with that is just being someone who is considered the poster child of the drug war gone bad. I just think that human stories are really important. And so we need to have our, nonprofits, churches. I know we tackle amount of issues within criminal justice reform, but, going in and trying to connect with those women that have lost those rights so we can humanize it and tell the human stories, and to have people have empathy that bring value, so that from there you can go to state representatives and have them hear the human stories and understand, how things have been impacted, and to figure out, what we can do in moving forward. But I do want to speak also to the flip side, and the fact of, number one, we still, and I don't have to preach to the choir, but, ending mass incarceration, because one of the things with this reproductive rights, I can remember sitting, there was a friend of mine, DeAnna, her name was DeAnna. And I can remember she was sentenced at a young age and sentenced to a significant amount of time. And one of the things that broke her heart the most, that she was depressed about, was that the fact that she wasn't ever going to be able to have kids. And I don't think people, think about that when they think about the criminal justice system and women in incarceration. And so we need to focus on our issues and figuring out how we can be most impactful in having laws that are specifically tailored to us and our children and our families.
Thanks, Kimba.
When you ask the question, how do we organize and how do we keep women who are in some part of the system front of mind for that, my first thought is it's not going to be hard to organize at first, right? I think people are very fired up about this issue because so many people realize how close this is to them. And I don't think the problem is going to be mobilizing people right now. But I do think that, as unfortunate as it is, I do think we are in for a long haul fight. And I think where we're going to see the issue is, do we have the stamina to maintain those kind of levels of organizing and doing the work that we have to do, on top of all of the other things that we have kind of coming at us in our everyday lives and in the public policy world, and just it's a lot, to have a pandemic and monkeypox and all this crazy stuff happening at our state and federal government levels, on top of, whatever you've got going on with your kids today and your car's not working. It's a lot just to get through the day, much less to sustain a long-term movement fight, which is, I wish that I could see something different right now, but I don't. I do think that this is going to have to be something that we sadly have to work on for a while. And, I think we can start now by building in the conversation. But, ultimately, if we don't care about women on the outside, it's going to be next to impossible to get people to care about the women who are on the inside. So we have to work hard at not letting those two things separate from each other, right? Like, women on the inside are still women, and we still have to fight for them, and they are included in everything that we're talking about. Just buckle up, y'all. It's going to be a long haul. And I think I would wrap it up with something that DeAnna said in our pre-call warm-up, which was, we haven't been practicing self-care. We've been practicing aftercare. And that's like the golden nugget that I'm taking away from today, was DeAnna saying that, is like, how do we build in a plan to take care of ourselves, to sustain us for the long haul? And I know how hard that is. I know how impossible it is. All of these fights that we're taking on feel so urgent, and people's lives are literally at stake. And if we don't care for ourselves and each other, then nobody will.
Great. Thank you for that, Lauren. I think, you tapped into something that's been really bothering me, or making me want to be more boisterous about the importance of seeing incarcerated people as human, the importance of we're not invisible, and the importance of, when policies and decisions are being made, the importance of us being in the rooms, right? The importance of those conversations being inclusive of people with lived experience to share how this will impact. Because a lot of times, and a lot of our elected officials who make these decisions, one, I always say, men making decisions about women reproductive rights has no understanding or no right to even pull that trigger. But the fact that a lot of times policy on paper looks good, but implementation into the community doesn't. I always say the 94 crime bill was perfect on paper to a solution they thought, but nobody realized the devastation that was going to be caused across this country around the lack of access to education, around Pell Grants, right? The mass over incarceration of individuals. And now we're finding ourselves in this place. And while, Kimba, you spoke to, we've been doing great work in criminal justice, in some way of an aspect to appear as if we're decarcerating, but all we're doing is creating new policies that contribute to incarceration. So in one way, it looks as if we're passing laws that people don't have to be incarcerated around substance abuse, they don't have to be around mental illness, but then we come backdoor it with another law that actually replaces those people. So I always say we're swapping people out. We're running out of time. This has been a great conversation. I want to get some final thoughts from the panelists that you have as we start closing out with our audience. Any final words that you guys have for them?
So I'll start. So since it is Women's Equality Day, I'm going to quote Sojourner Truth, who was an abolitionist and obviously fought for women's suffrage. But one of the things that she said, and I'm just going to paraphrase because I can't find the direct quote, talked about keeping the pot stirring. And that is going to be so critical for this whole idea that we are in this fight for the long haul. And so we need to keep this pot stirring until nobody's free until we're all free. And so we need to make sure that the work that we're doing, and that when we are exhausted, we take that time, but make sure that we have folks who are able to pick up that mantle and do the work as well. And so that we can do what we need to do to recharge and reset, but get back in there. This is a collective effort. This is not just a flash in the pan and a panicked response to what the Supreme Court has done. This is a long haul, so that our daughters and our granddaughters and our great granddaughters are not having these conversations. They're not needing to have these conversations. So that is my final thought. So we need to keep pressing, keep on keeping on.
Thank you, Senator.
My final thoughts are just, again, DeAnna, thanking you and your leadership and what you've been doing. And, I'm forever grateful to being part of the 2019 cohort of Leading with Conviction. Encourage, any formerly incarcerated person to please go on Just Leadership site to see how you can be involved. But also just encouraging people to look up colleagues of mine that have events that's going on that's centered around women. Andrea James, we were actually at the same prison facility, but I left just before she came in. But through her experience, she came out and started this organization. And basically she has a conference, Free Her Conference, in October in Detroit. So if you just look up Free Her 2022, you'll see information about it, and I'm sure this conversation will be continued there. But there, Amy Pofall, she has Can Do Foundation, Can Do Clemency website, and I have a friend, Michelle West, who's serving a life sentence, and it breaks my heart that she's still incarcerated. So we continue to push, and Lauren, we're in this for the long haul. And she's been in prison for over 28 years. And even when I get tired, I have to be forced to think of her, because I just pray that God continues to give her strength, and all of our incarcerated women today. So we just have to keep pushing forward. So I thank you all for having me today.
Thank you, Kimba.
Gosh, we should have let Kimba end, because that was perfect. And now I don't feel as well prepared. But I think that the thing that I would leave you with is that, it's very overwhelming when you have to think about this on top of everything else as a long-term fight. Civil rights stuff has been going on for a long time, and we haven't even scratched the surface on what needs to be done. And so to just add one more thing to the list feels completely overwhelming. And so the thing that I think a lot about these days is how community is the solution to everything. And, it's not because if you get in community, somebody knows how to fix the problems. It's that if you're in community, the problems aren't as big anymore. And, so I would say take time to come together as part of your movement building, but I would also say take the time to come together to just be in community when you're not under attack, when there's not some big thing coming up on your tail that you have to fight against. Just find your people and spend some time in community as a way to refill your cup. And that's what's going to get us through.
Thank you, Lauren. I want to thank you, our panelists and our audience, for joining us today for this important conversation. I ask anyone to join the Just Us campaign at jlusa.org/justus to demand that our lawmakers protect the health and human dignity of incarcerated people today. I want to close with these words, that we're all part of a movement. We're all engaged in some type of reform or changing conditions of confinement for individuals who are incarcerated. I just want everyone to make sure that their movement isn't consistent of running in place, right? At Just Leadership, we always say that Shirley Chisholm said that if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. For those of us who are formerly incarcerated or directly impacted by this issue, we're at the point of we'll build our table and give you an invitation. And part of that is joining the movement around Just Leadership's Just Us campaign to demand the changes that we need to see and actually have occur for our incarcerated loved ones. Again, Kimba, Lauren, Senator, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. This is the beginning of what we have to stay in tune for. And I just say for everyone, let's buckle up, because this is not a fight we can drop. Thank you.